I work with think tanks all over the world and all over the United States. And I have to tell you, Steamboat Institute is absolutely world class. No, sincerely, they have been innovative and creative, mixing action and information on some of the most important strategic issues. I am such a fan. So if you are a supporter or you engage with them or work with them, God bless you, because these are people who are doing exactly the right thing. You really are in the right place. I want to tell you a story. I don't think I've ever told anybody this story. So at the end of the Cold War, I was in the Army. At the end of the Cold War, I was the targeter for 7th Corps, and the avenue of approach came through Czechoslovakia. And so whenever we did a war game, my job on day one, the first thing I did was I literally blew up Czechoslovakia. Well, not the whole, but like the little city, like right at the crossing point where they came out, I just obliterated. I did it every day. Matter of fact, one time, I ran into my counterpart many, many years later, and I said, I just want to really apologize. Every day when we started the war with you guys, the first thing I did was I obliterated you guys. He goes, that's okay, because I did the same to you. So, but the thing was, as soon as the wall came down, the first thing I did, actually in weather kind of almost exactly like this, is I went to this little town, and it was the most pathetic place I'd ever seen in my entire life. It was completely run down. The church was boarded up. The snow was black, because they burned coal. And I don't know if you've ever been in one of these Eastern European cities. In the old days, it was just that acrid, bitter smell. There was nothing in the store windows. And I just felt terrible. Like that I slaughtered these people, that were just kind of innocents in the way. And the good news is I went back just a few months later, and the streets were cleaned up, the church was open, there was food in the windows. And I tell you this story because the one thing, two things. One is that the people there were so appreciative of freedom. And if there's one thing that has not changed in Europe, anywhere in Europe, it's nobody wants to live with the Russians again. Nobody wants to be their friend. Nobody wants them to be their overlord. Nobody wants to be a suburb of Moscow. Nothing has changed. And I'll tell you the one thing about the Russians that really matters. The people that are running this country today are every bit as evil, every bit as rapacious, every bit as venal, every bit as destructive as the people that ran the Soviet Union that sought to end the world. So we could talk a lot about Russia, the Russian threat, but we should get to the real issues like, why do we care? And I think that's a really important issue, particularly for American conservatives, because it's an issue that's really central to what's going on in the conservative movement. And this is not the conservative movement that we were born into. Things have changed so much from Reagan era, when conservatism was really this novel idea of fusionism, or not Confucianism, but fusionism, where we got religious conservatives, evangelicals, fiscal conservatives, and national security conservatives all kind of vote for the same people. And that was pretty much it. And that just doesn't really cut it anymore. Not only today are these issues so complex and intertwined, they're all central to each other and central to our future. And so the hallmark of the modern conservative movement is we all have to embrace and be concerned about the core equities that determine the future of our country and the potential for human flourishing and prosperity. You can't really lead the conservative movement and not care about the life issue or care about the national debt. And this, I think, has profound issues in the national security space for conservatives. As we have gotten more partisan in the 20th centuries, and the two political parties have really come to represent two very, very divergent paths for the future of America, in some ways, foreign policy has gotten almost more cartoonish, and you've had this kind of, people just kind of, either we're going to be isolationists or restrainers, and we're just going to sit at home on our hands and do nothing, or we're going to go out and bomb and conquer the world. And I think one of the things that we try to do at the Heritage Foundation is to really develop this idea. For the conservative movement, there really is a third way. Between these really kind of really cartoonish extremes that are really based on ideology and orthodoxy and not really based on the world in which we live. And that is to base something which has actually always been fundamental to how conservatives approach foreign policy as national interest. What is in the best interest for all Americans? And while that really works for us, is we're a feisty lot to begin with, And fundamentally, you really can't have a good conversation or a good discussion about national interests unless you're willing to roll up your sleeves and really debate and argue differences. So I find the fact today that conservatives argue over foreign policy a really healthy and productive thing. I'm excited that people want to debate Ukraine policy or what to do about things, because I think that's how you get to good policy. And if you have an honest, clear debate, that's what builds the strength of the conservative movement. And I think bringing national interest rather than this is the left's orthodoxy, or this is somebody else's orthodoxy, or I want to do everything to solve that problem, but I don't care about the others. It's like your doctor. Well, he looks pretty healthy. Well, he doesn't actually look that healthy. It's like his doctor telling him, "Yeah, I'll cure." He just looking on his phone, so he doesn't know. "I'll cure your heart disease," right? And then you could die of brain cancer, right? That doesn't work. It's like, how do we, we have all these interests. How do we rack and stack them, and how do we address them equitably? So it's a good, healthy, constructive debate to have, and Europe's a great place to do that. So let me unpack that for you just a little bit. Who are we? America is a global power with global interests and global responsibilities. It's just that simple. We are who we are. We're not the world's policeman. We're not the world's babysitter. We're not the world's fireman. We should do responsibly what any nation should do, is to look after our interests. And when you're a global power, that's pretty profound, right? If you think about it, when you go on vacation, he doesn't go on vacation, he works hard. But she goes on vacation, she looks like she enjoys vacation. When she goes on vacation, right, and you run out of money, and you're in Lisbon? Yeah, Lisbon's a good place to go. She's in Lisbon, she runs out of money. She doesn't say, oh, she gets on a plane and flies home to get money from her bank. She goes to an ATM. Because that just makes more sense, it's more equitable. So the three great lily pads that really tie the world together and allow the United States to have access to protect our interests around the world, not that other places aren't important, but really are Western Europe, the greater Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific. There's a reason why throughout all modern history, really since World War II, we spend most of our time in those places. That doesn't mean they need to be the land of milk and honey and have no wars and no problems wherever, but the United States would generally like them to be stable, because that's in our interest for it to be so. It's fundamentally not much different from when we looked at the world in 1942. So we can tolerate a lot of things, but a Europe on fire and burning to the ground is not one of them. So we do have interests in Western Europe. And then the question is, what's the most equitable way to secure them? And I'm going to talk about three things really quickly, so that Mary can come up and talk, because she's really the smart one anyway, that we can and should do. And I think only conservatives can do. And this is what gets me really excited, because only conservatives are really prepared to lead on the global stage in the year ahead. And let me lay them out for you very quickly. One this group knows very well. One is energy security. If you are Europe, you cannot deal with a competitor and have a strategic dependency on that competitor. Anybody who's ever got divorced understands that. So for Europe, the notion that Europe could be dependent on Russian energy to survive and yet be independent in Russia is unthinkable. And only conservatives understand that the path to energy security cannot go through climate change and net zero. That this is an anathema to prosperity and security in the future. The only way to really address environmental and economic and security issues is by delivering affordable, reliable, dependable energy, period. Only American conservatives understand that. And therefore, Europe needs us to work with them and partner them on energy security, because that's the number one thing. I mean, there's only three things that can really break this thing up. One is the malicious activity from Russia. The other is the overflowing bad problems from the greater Middle East and Africa. We can talk about those. The third one is China just biting them out, right? So we can talk about the other two. But in getting the Russians off the table, it starts with energy security. It's absolutely a prerequisite. Matter of fact, we've only seen Europeans move in this direction, not because they hate Greta Thunberg, but because they've actually grasped the reality that their own self-destruction is in being dependent on Russian energy. The second one is on just stopping the Russians from even thinking about invading NATO territory. And we actually saw the answer to this in Ukraine. And it's not actually in some massive Reagan-era rebuilding and sending millions of American troops to Europe. It's in what's called conventional deep strike. It's basically killing all the Russians before they even think about crossing the border. This is this kind of cartoonish debate we have about pivoting, right? You know, we need to pivot to Asia. We need to pivot. This is all nonsense. American military is not pivoting anywhere. First of all, 70% of the US Navy is where? Thank you. It's in Asia, right? So there's no Navy to pivot, right? If we pivoted the rest of the Navy to Asia, we wouldn't be able to do anything, like, you know, open up the Red Seas, for example. So the Navy's already there. 90% of the US Army is stationed, thank you, it's in the United States of America. And it's going to stay there, right? Because if we're a global power and we have to send our army somewhere, where's the best place for it to be to go in any direction? And the answer is in the United States. Thank you very much. So there's no army to pivot, right? The Air Force is stationed all over the world. That's fine because we're unique in that our Air Force actually deploys globally. So it actually doesn't matter where our Air Force is. We can send it wherever we need it to be. Matter of fact, it's a good idea that it's all spread out because it's easier for us to get places. And the Space Force, this may shock you, the Space Force is in space and it's going to stay there. So this isn't about moving big things around. This is really about what can we bring to the table that will really keep the Russians in their place in the future? And it really is conventional deep strike. That doesn't require a lot more troops. It does require partnership. It does require the Europeans to do their part and build the right things. That's a very doable thing. Energy, we got this as conservatives. We know how to lead on that. Sound defense policy, that's actually about doing things that work as opposed to how many drag queen shows can we host or, how many DEI officers can we hire, or how many electric tanks can we buy? Okay, we get that, right? So we are set to lead on that. And this actually is going to be one of the greatest challenges because we also understand that the debt is unsustainable. Every military buildup that we've ever done was in deficit spending. That's going to be a real challenge in the future environment. We're getting the debt down as important as all our other strategic priorities. We get that. And the third thing is something that maybe people haven't really wrapped their heads around, but it's actually something conservatives are really good at. And it's this, is if the one advantage that we have over the Russians today, in addition to them getting their army kicked in Ukraine, is that nobody wants to be a suburb of Russia. So if you look across the entire post-Soviet space, everything from the former Central Europe through the Black Sea and the Caucasus into Central Asia, Russia's grip on all of them is weakening. Armenia is a good example. If you look at Armenia, which was a basket case of Russian influence, and the Armenians they even passed a law so Vladimir Putin couldn't actually go to Armenia, right? There's a profound opportunity there because what they all need and are clamoring for is really infrastructure development. Because they were trapped in the old post-Soviet space, they never really had an opportunity to develop the infrastructure that we did in Western Europe. So if you look at Western Europe, for example, all the infrastructure goes east-west, and what they really need is kind of north-south integration, and the Black Seas. And for the first time, the Caucasus and Central Asia are really opening up as a vital source of energy and connectivity and resources. Because the middle corridor, this idea of going through the Black Sea, through the Caucasus into Central Asia, it's no more about connecting China to the west. It's really about connecting Central Asia and the Caucasus in the west. And this is so profound if you think about this. This is the first time in the history of these countries, since really World War I, where they could actually make their own choices on connectivity and integration. And what's important about for us is if these projects all converge, what does that do? Pushes Russia off, pushes Iran off, it pushes China back. It sucks away all the places and all the spaces where they really have an opportunity to meddle. This is in US interest to have that happen. And it doesn't require our tax dollars. It doesn't require our armies and our navies. It really requires the United States to be a supportive partner. This is about diplomacy. It's about politics. It's about private sector investment. All the kinds of things that conservatives are actually really, really good at. I think these are really the key threes to the future. I can't tell you what's going to happen in Russia, or happen inside Russia, or happen inside China, or happen inside Iran, but I can tell you this. I know how to prevent them from being a problem for us. And the way to do that is to increase our own strengths so there aren't vulnerabilities for them to exploit. And the reason why I think it's important for that conversation to hear is there's all kinds of great reasons to want conservatives to take the helm of national leadership again. One of the most profound is that these people and their incredible desire for freedom, for their own freedom, for peace in the world, and for prosperity for themselves and the partners that they work with, is that is uniquely today the most powerful, the most practical, and the most impactful vision that can be. So I do go to sleep at night praying that conservatives are running American foreign policy in the future. Thanks. Mary?
Thanks very much, Jim.
Okay, can I say something when they're taking this? I have to say something with this. I had no idea that Mary had all this like Ellen DeGeneres kind of talent. This is crazy, right? Is there going to be like a Mary Kessel like morning talk show? Because I would like totally.
I don't know.
I would totally, right? Like Mary in the morning, I would totally tune into that.
I don't know, but I would be nicer to my staff. Anyway. So, wow, there's a lot to think about there, and something I really loved about your presentation, Jim, is that you're talking about proactive, positive things that we can do to address the threat today, which is very, very important, because I think we're very good at saying what's wrong, but not necessarily how to fix it. So thank you for that, and the comments that you made, too, about Central Asia and how that's changing, that doesn't get a lot of attention. Please, by the way, start sending in your questions, because I know that we're going to have a lot from the audience. But maybe I'll start with this. Often in our national debates, especially on the conservative side, you hear this sloganeering. Why should we care about a border over there when we can't deal with our border down here? Which is probably one of the most asinine things I've ever heard. Can you answer, why do we talk in those terms? We're America. Can't we do both? Why do we need to care? Why do we need, to take your title, to get realistic about Russia for our national security?
Yeah, the first thing I would say is when we talk about this term realism and realistic, they're really two different things. Everybody thinks they're realistic. Joe Biden thinks he's realistic.
Yep.
Well, I mean, if your job is to, not work much, yeah, I mean, everybody thinks they're being realistic. Nobody thinks, well, I'm doing this. This is crazy. This isn't going to work. Realism is different. Having a policy based on realism is based on interests. That your first and primary responsibility is to take care of your community, people first. And that's actually, if you think about it, if everybody had that approach, right? If the answer is, I want to see the flourishing of my community, of my state, of my people, we actually would have a much more better and stable world. So to get to your question, when people kind of put out these artificial contrasts of either or, right? I want this, but not that. And they both fit in the category of interest. You know right there, then and there, right? You're being sold a bill of goods, right? So go back to the guy who is, look, he's better. He looks better, right? But it's like, honestly, if you go to your doctor and the doctor said you have brain cancer, you have a bad heart, you have a blood disease, which of the three do you want me to cure? And they're all going to kill you. Then what kind of choice is that, right? And so I actually think that what Republicans are doing now in the Congress by holding up the issue of border security and Ukraine funding, I just think that's being realistic. Who thinks that a member of Congress could go back to their voter and say, I'm going to care about that thing, but I'm not going to care about this thing, and this thing is just as damn, who would take a vote like that? So I'm all for that. And actually, if you undercut the real reality of what's going on here, and you really just take a deep breath and unpack this, what just happened here? Joe Biden, the President of the United States, who spent over $100 billion helping defend Ukraine, is now basically saying he is willing to let Ukraine fail rather than address a very legitimate issue at the security of the border. And what that tells you is this is a guy who really doesn't care about any of America's interests. He really cares about his policies. So I love it when conservatives get together and argue. Matter of fact, I'm evil. I actually try to get them all, I actually seek out all my friends that disagree with each other, and I try to bring them in the same room because, and I'm happy that they're passionate about their perspective and their ideas, because I know, because I've seen this happen again and again, when I get them all in a room and they actually start to all argue with each other, like the British and Americans did, trying to figure out the strategy for World War II, they actually all get to a good place. I don't want to name names, but I've had people like Bridge Colby. Bridge is a great guy. He's a very thoughtful strategist, and he's very focused on shifting to deal with the China challenge. But when you actually get Bridge in a room with everybody else, the first Bridge will acknowledge is, okay, dealing with the China challenge doesn't mean we can do zero every other place in the world. And then you start to get to really creative, constructive ways to deal with issues.
Why is the Ukraine war a problem for U.S. national security?
So this is, when you look at interests, we've lost this kind of skill when the Cold War ended, because we got fat and lazy. We didn't really have to worry about priorities and things, because we just figured we could just, we could elect Bill Clinton president, everything would be fine. The way you have to look at interests is everything cannot be the top priority and can't get all the resources. That's the definition of why you have interests, so you can help prioritize. So we break them into 3 categories. Vital. Dude, if we don't get this right, we're all going to die. I would put border security in that category. Border security is a vital interest. Look at what's going on the border. If we just let this go on for we will lose this country. So that's a vital interest. Then you go down to things that are important. It would be nice to get a win in this column. If we lose, it's not the end of the day, but it'd be nice. And then things that are, peripheral. We kind of like to do good here. If we do good here, things may be a little better. So the difference is Ukraine fits in the category of important, but not vital. I love Ukrainians, and I've been to Ukraine, and I want the Ukrainians to win, and I want the Russians to lose. But let's be honest. We went through the entire Cold War. Ukraine and the entire Black Sea and all of Eastern Europe were on the other side, and we still won. So you can't make an argument that if we lose these things, the world's going to come to an end, because there were lots of times when we didn't have those things, and we were fine. So it's not a vital interest, but it is an important interest, which means we should do something that makes sense. And that means it should be suitable. It should achieve our goals. It should be feasible. Should be able to do it, and it should be acceptable. It's something that people are willing to support. And of course, the number one problem that we had the Biden administration, and part of the reason that we've had this space here is because the one thing Biden never did is he never sat down with the American people. Do you remember him talking to you? I don't think so. He never sat down with the American people and said, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, and this is how we're going to achieve success. He never said that. Not only did he not say that, which I think created a lot of space for conservatives to be unsettled because he's not articulating how he's actually defending the interests, but he actually did the opposite. He actually consciously sought to pit conservatives against conservatives by driving a Ukraine policy, which is spending money on Ukraine, and at the same time actually undercutting all the other interests that we hold dear. So if you look, for example, at every single supplemental package, which was a Ukraine package, right? There's like, here's spending for Ukraine, and this is how much money actually gets spent. And all of this stuff is nonsense and actually destructive. And every time Republicans just sign off on that, what he's actually doing is undermining the credibility of Republicans, right? And really exploiting them. So he's really exploiting bipartisanship in the worst way. When in World War II, a lot of people didn't like FDR, in the New Deal and everything else. But FDR's explicit policy in World War II was to keep Republicans on board. And he never politicized the war. Joe Biden did exactly the opposite. He politicized the war from day one to try to harm Republicans and to try to take more control in government. So yeah, that's why conservatives, I think, were broadly upset with Joe Biden in the war in Ukraine.
Well, this I think you've hit on really the nub of the debate. Is the Ukraine war a vital interest? Is it an important interest? This morning we heard Secretary Pompeo say that Putin has always wanted to expand beyond Ukraine. He's very clear about it. He said it for many years. And in fact, we can't treat it like a territorial dispute. We need to equip them to win, and we can't think about it in isolation. It's not a US policy towards Russia. We're facing an axis. It's Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. So we need to start talking in a more realistic way, back to the title of your speech. So there's a question.
Let me take like a simple analogy to this, right?
Yep.
We can do this one of two ways, because the challenge at the end of the day is not the freedom of Ukraine, as much as I love Ukrainians. It's about destabilizing Western Europe and the destruction of NATO, and that directly is a vital interest to us. So if it was this, it's like you could wait and you could go skiing every day for the rest of your life on the slopes, half naked, right? Until you get skin cancer and melanoma and wait till it metastasizes till stage 3, right? You could do that, right? And then deal with the cancer. Or you could wear sunglasses and, and sunscreen, right? And that's, again, not dissing my Ukrainian friends, but when somebody says we're all in for as long as it takes, that's fairy dust and nonsense. We should be willing to do the kinds of things that are sunscreen and sunglasses. And what are those? Look, military aid, particularly now, is the one thing that only the United States, there wouldn't be a Ukraine today without US military aid. But the Europeans should be doing more. They should be picking up a lot of the civil responsibilities. They should be picking up reconstruction. And I think it was very doable. And I think people would have supported Joe Biden in that if he'd been honest and straight with us, and he never was.
I wonder if there's a compromise here, and that it may not matter if it's categorized as a vital or important interest. If we had equipped them earlier, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. I want to get to audience questions because one of these questions points out a fracture in Europe, and I'll just read it. What do you think about Hungary and recently Slovakia taking a pro-Russian stance and becoming unaligned with the European Union and with the West? In other words, are there things happening in Europe today that are starting to show division that we should be concerned about, that might change your point of view?
I think most of the news on Europe is crap, as most news is crap. It is very much driven by political narratives.
Except for Julio.
That's Julio. No, Julio's a good example, right?
Yeah.
Julio gets his news by going to where people are and actually talking to them, and then reporting on what's actually happening, rather than sitting in a nice office and watching Twitter and then saying, okay, how do I take what people are reporting and putting that into the current narrative and making sure that's spit out? And much like Julio, I spend all my time on the road, which is why my wife hates me. She loves me, but she'd be the first to tell you, like, this is not, and I've been all over Europe. I've spent more time in Hungary than most Hungarians. And here's what I will tell you, the dirty little secret. First of all, Hungary loves NATO. The last thing Hungary would ever want to see is NATO lose. The last thing the Hungarians would ever want is the Russians on their border. They've had the Russians on their border. They've worked for the Russians. It wasn't fun. Having said that, this government in particular has a lot of issues with the European Union. And unlike, I think, some politicians here, he is unwilling to just throw in the towel and do what everybody wants to be part of the team. Not only is he unwilling to do that, he's actually gone the other way. He's actually used the issue to needle the other side. But here's the dirty reality that the Hungarians won't tell you, right? And don't tell them I told you, okay? Because they like the whole bad guy image. They like that. First of all, Hungary is actually not only rearmed faster than most countries in Europe and modernizing its military to deal with the Russian threat. Hungary is actually the most aggressive country in Europe on rebuilding their arms industry. Because the one thing that Europeans really need is everything from small arms to artillery munitions. And Hungary is gearing up big time. They're going to be one of NATO's most credible and important defense suppliers. The Hungarians did a lot for refugees that came to their country. They've done a lot for the Ukrainians. And the irony is they don't like to talk about it, right? They don't actually like to talk about the fact that they're helping the Ukrainians, even though there's a lot of political disagreements between the Ukrainians and Hungary. And the Hungarians, in the end, the Hungarians have never done anything. They have never taken a policy stand that's actually hurt the defense of Ukraine. So there's a lot of politics going on there, but the notion that somehow these countries are out for Russia to win, that's not true, and it's also not true for Slovakia.
Jim, we had a really interesting panel on international engagement, isolationism versus kind of international engagement. And one of the things we discussed was getting allies to help, to pay their fair share, to do a number of things to help us deal with these various wars, Ukraine, Israel, other potential conflicts in the future. Since you've traveled so much to Europe, you've talked with these officials, what has to happen here? What needs to change? Do we need President Trump to come back and just sit on these guys and force them to do what they've promised? I mean, what needs to happen here?
And this is from somebody that's spent a lot of time in Europe. Europe is changing, and it's changing, I think, maybe not as fast as some would like, but fairly dramatically. And it's changing for the one reason that you would really admire. It's changing because it's in their interest to change. Because in their own self-defense and future, they recognize that they can't deal with the Russians. I'll give you a great example, which is Italy, which for many years was an apologist for the Russians. Meloni came to power and a strong conservative and completely unafraid and unabashedly said, no. The Russians are not our friend. We need a stronger Europe. We need a stronger Italy. And I don't care how much Russian oligarch money is floating around. That is not our future. That's what's changing Europe. Here's the problem, and Germany's a good example. You know, it's always fun to contrast Germany and Hungary because really until very recently, German foreign policy and defense policy was indistinguishable from Hungarian foreign policy. And actually the Germans were way worse. And everybody's attacking Hungary for like being the embassy of democracy. But actually the great leader of the European economy and the European militaries was actually the worst violator of placating the Russians and not holding up their end. But nobody picked on them. Germany has started to change. We've seen some of that. Why hasn't Germany changed faster?
George made this point.
Yeah,
in
and
another panel.
it goes down to one word.
Yep.
One word, Joe Biden. No, the problem that the Germans have is they love Joe Biden because he's just like they are. All the things that they talked about, and also all the things that the ambassador talked about, we're all part of this multinational. They love that. They love not being pushed. But that's exactly what the Germans don't need. The Germans need to be pushed to face up to their own interests, their own responsibilities, and their own problems. And so we don't need an enabler, like enabling your son to be a drug addict and then saying, well, I love my son, so I don't care if he's a criminal and a drug addict because I love him, right? You need the opposite. You say, I do love you, and for that reason, I don't want you to be a drug addict or criminal, right? What the Germans need is tough love. And what Trump actually gave them was tough love. And the dirty little secret is the Germans kind of knew that. And 99% of the opposition of Germans, of Western Europe governments that hated Trump to Trump was, they didn't like to admit it in public. They created this mythology that Trump was evil. And therefore, when they had to acknowledge that Trump was right, they hated to say that in public because they couldn't admit that they were wrong and they wanted their own voters. But I will tell you this, I'll tell you this in all honesty. And having talked to everybody, nobody believes that Joe Biden is good for America, good for the transatlantic community, or good for Western Europe and Europe. None of them truly believe that. If they do believe that, they were hanging out with Hunter. They'll never say it in public, but they just don't believe that. Everybody in Europe wants America back, and they understand that the America they want back is not one that's going to solve all their problems for them, and because they want an America back that's a partner. They'll do their share, we do our share. That's what they really, really want. And so whether they tell you or not, no matter how much they, put pins in Donald Trump dolls, the reality is they want a conservative American foreign policy.
Even the French?
The French were the ones that say we should get Ukraine to NATO. I mean, this is ridiculous, right? The French went from being like, NATO is brain dead to saying, well, the only way we can save Europe is to bring Ukraine to NATO. I mean, they just completely flipped on it out.
I'm going to get as many questions from the audience in as I can, so please keep sending them. Here's another one, a good one. What would you say to conservatives who wish to cut all funding to Ukraine?
Yeah, I think you would be basically, you don't get back the money you've spent, so you get nothing from that, right? And the reality is this is the reality of the war. I don't care what anybody tells you. All right, victory, defeat, all this is not. This is absolutely a reality. It's a strategic stalemate. It's already a strategic stalemate. It's going to remain a strategic stalemate. The future of Ukraine is going to look like Germany in 1945, divided, you know. Korea in 53, right, divided, never a clear end to the hostilities. Israel in 68, 73, right, survives but surrounded by, right? That's the reality of where we're going to be.
Isn't that a choice?
No, that's just the reality, because what are the options? The option of victory, well, there is no victory, right, in the sense that Ukraine fights back to its borders. Okay, big deal. The borders are no more defensible than where they are now, so the Russians can still attack them. So that's not an end of the war because Ukraine takes its border. Russia collapses, you know, from what I say, from your lips to God's ears. But the reason why we're never going to have World War III is because the reality of two things. We're never going to attack the Russians, and the Russians are never going to attack us, right? So Russia and Ukraine are going to continue to fight it out. And ensuring a stable Ukraine that's free is in our best interest. Now, the devil's in the details. What are some of the things that we're worried about? One is people want to reconstruct Ukraine. Good idea. China should not reconstruct Ukraine. Really bad idea, right? If we win Ukraine and then we let the Chinese in, the whole thing falls apart. We should holding Ukraine's feet to the fire about dealing with corruption and these things. We should do that, right? Because it does no good to have a free and independent Ukraine, which then lapses into all the old bad behaviors that make people not care about whether they have a country or not. You know, the dirty little secret in all this is when people talk about Ukrainian corruption. Why was there massive corruption in Ukraine? He knows the answer to this. Because the Russians were there. All of the 99% of the really deep institutional corruption in Ukraine was because of the influence of Russian oligarchs. So when the war happened, actually, that was the biggest gift that God could ever give to Ukraine, because they could start to break the monopoly of the Russian oligarchs on the economy. And so that has really started Ukraine in the right direction. Ukraine has to modernize its economy, and it has to build a capacity for self-defense, because that's the only way it survives. So supporting that does make sense, and we can do that in a reasonable way, I think.
Interesting question about kind of a swing state that we don't hear much about, Turkey. Should Turkey remain in NATO? What's Turkey's role here in helping us resolve some of these disputes?
First of all, whether Turkey remains in NATO is actually up to Turkey. I mean, only Turkey could leave NATO. And is Turkey ever going to leave NATO? And the answer is zero. And the reason is, why is that? It's because it's in Turkey's interest to be in NATO, because they don't want the Russians running things, and they don't want the Iranians thing. And look, and again, I've spent a lot of time with these countries, and I spent a lot of time with the Turks, and we have issues with their government. But if you just listen to the narrative that, you know, Turkey's this, they're not. I mean, Turkey's got issues and challenges, but at the end of the day, Turkey is committed to NATO because it's in Turkey's interest, which is the reason why I love countries to be in NATO. And again, dirty little secret, right? The reason why Ukraine is in good a shape as it is right now is because when the Russians reneged on the grain deal, which was basically cutting the lifeline of Ukraine exports and really would destabilize a good chunk of the world because food couldn't get out, who stepped in and made sure that the grain flowed? And the answer is the Turks did that.
Well, and that goes to a panel that we also had earlier today on supply chains with Elaine from FTD. So a lot of overlapping themes today in our seminar. Here's another great one. Oh gosh, I just lost it. Oh goodness me. Poland. Is Poland safe from Putin? Yes.
And again, this I think is an interest where an example where vital interest really works. So I don't know how much you follow elections, but we have a new Polish government, which is only Poland, because this is super weird, right? Because the Conservative Party, which actually got most of the votes, didn't actually get enough votes didn't actually have enough, needed to pull together a coalition, and it couldn't. So we actually have a government that's run by the Liberals, even though they didn't win the election, because they went to the far right and the far left and pulled together enough people to put together a coalition government. They are, I think, really against everything the Poles actually want. Poles are conservative people. They want a strong national defense. They don't want to be dominated by the EU. We have to forget that just a few years ago, it was the Liberals who were excited and thrilled about Nord Stream 2 and thought that engaging with the Russians was oh so great and everything. And of course, they hate conservatives, they hate Republicans and all that. But the reality is the geography matters, right? And so this Polish government may not last, but even if it does last, the reality is they are going to need the U.S. as a strong partner to protect against the Russians, and I think they'll do that. I'm actually very, very optimistic about the future of Eastern and Central Europe, and I think actually, I think we have never in this world been better off than when the transatlantic community grew as a prosperous free community, and I do think it's like an oil spot from which great things can grow. I think the EU and these woke policies have really destroyed Europe. I think the future of Europe is in people that just are throwing this off. And so, while Joe Biden loves to go to Berlin and Brussels and Paris and think he's talked to all the important people and go home, if you go and you talk to everyday Europeans, just like when you go to Iowa and Texas and Florida and talk to everyday Americans, they want what we want. And I think that we're going to see this resurgence of a strong conservative voice in Europe. That's going to bring things like peace through strength, things like sound traditional policies for family, strong borders against illegal immigration, free market economies that work together. And I think Europe's going to make a comeback, and because I think those are the people that can lead the way. And I think people like the Hungarians and the Poles, the Norwegians, even the Swedes, the Finns, Southern Europe, the Italians, Greece, Romania. These are going to be our best and strongest partners. And this is can I end on this? There's just two ironies, right? One is, even my conservative brothers and sisters who I love with a deep passion, who don't care about Ukraine and say, just throw them overboard, we don't care. If you ask them, are there Europeans that you do love? They go, oh yeah, we love the Hungarians. We love the Polish conservatives. We love it. And I'm like, so you realize that all the people in Europe that you love and admire and want to work with, they don't want the Russians to win. So when you say, let's throw Ukraine under the bus, you realize you're throwing your friends under the bus too. And my other argument is, well, we need to pivot to Asia, right? So when I go to Europe, who's in Europe? The Japanese, the Taiwanese, the Koreans, all the Asians. Well, why are the Asians in Europe? Because the Asians recognize that a strong Europe and a strong transatlantic community is key for them too. It's key for battling China and Russia, which have both their interests. So you have to just throw out all this crap that you hear from pundits and media when they talk about global relations and stuff. And you either have to go to, which is the much more fun part, right? Go to these parts of the world, go to Azerbaijan and Central Asia and Europe and Latin America and Ecuador, and talk to real live living people about their lives, or talk and listen to people that do that. Because I think what you will find is, a lot of people in the world would love to be us. And they want to do the kinds of things we do. And they are our greatest friends and most natural partners. And there's only two great sins in the world. One is that we would turn our back on the people most passionate to be our friends and partners, or we would destroy in ourselves what they admire most.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Jim Carafano.